Good morning. My name is Sarah. Sarah is a common name nowadays, but I am the original Sarah, one of the ancestors of Jesus. Today I'm here to tell you a little bit about my life with my husband Abraham, and how after many, many long years of waiting, we finally became parents. Like most couples, we hoped for a child, but God gave us more than a child. Along with the child, God gave us a promise that would last through all generations. But the truth is, for years on end, we didn't think we'd get the child or the promise. Actually, let me rephrase that. God was always making promises to us, and to Abraham especially, but we didn't see any proof of the promises. We didn't see them coming true. And so the question for both of us was, should we go on trusting God, especially when there's so little evidence that God will do what he's promised to do, or should we just quit God and look after ourselves instead? I have to admit, I was tempted, and sometimes I failed. God was always saying amazing things to my husband, like, "I will make of you a great nation. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Your very own son will inherit everything you own. Look at the sky and count the stars. That's how many children, grandchildren, and descendants you will have." Well, Abraham believed God every single time God said one of these grand things. And God seemed mighty impressed with Abraham just for believing. And for believing what sounded to me like empty promises. Because, well, I haven't told you the most important detail yet. By the time God started speaking to us, Abraham and I were old. In fact, the first time God spoke to my husband, he was 75 years old. Not exactly a young man in the prime of his youth. I am not quite as old as my husband, but I'm no spring chicken either. I was not in any condition to have a child. Ladies, you understand me. After a certain age, a baby just doesn't happen. I was way past that age. And that was in the early stages of our friendship with God. Years passed, and no child. Of course there was no child. A child was impossible for me. So I got impatient. I took matters into my own hands. It's the most embarrassing episode of my life, and I won't say much about it here. Just basically, I gave my servant woman to Abraham and suggested he try to have a baby with her. She was young enough, and it worked. She got pregnant and had a son. I thought I'd solved Abraham's problem for him, though, as you might guess, I ended up really hating my servant woman. I know, I brought it on myself. Believe me, I've come to regret this deeply. And anyway, it wasn't the answer God had in mind. God looked after my servant and her son because I sure couldn't do it. All I was left with was deep humiliation, and still no child. So more years passed. God kept promising, but not delivering. Abraham got older. I got older. In fact, believe it or not, Abraham had his 100th birthday, and I hit 90 years of age. Very definitely too old to be a first-time mother. Yet once again, God was talking and saying to Abraham, "Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. I will establish my covenant with your son as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." This time, Abraham laughed at God. He just laughed. I guess even Abraham had his limits of belief. Really, God? Me? At 100? My wife? At 90? Having our first son after all these years of trying and hoping? I never thought I'd say it, but God, you are funny. Well, God is funny sometimes, because it was only after Abraham laughed in God's face that God finally made his promises come true. It happened on a hot day. I was inside the tent working on lunch. Abraham, old man that he was, sat outside in the shade of some trees. All of a sudden, 3 men were standing there in front of him. Abraham has always been friendly, so we welcomed the 3 men to eat lunch with him. They accepted and sat down. Abraham rushed into the tent and told me to make extra food. Then he rushed out to where we keep the animals and told the servant boy, slaughter and roast a calf. Considering how fast we had to put it together, I think we produced a beautiful meal. Of course, according to the customs of our times, I stayed hidden in the tent cooking. I didn't come out to eat with them, but the 3 visitors obviously knew someone was inside the tent who had made all this nice food for them. So they asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Now that was the first funny thing about their visit. Up till now, it had been normal. But Abraham never once mentioned my name to them. How did they know it? At that time, Sarah was an uncommon name. They couldn't have just guessed. Well, Abraham answered that I was inside the tent. Then, another funny thing happened. I don't know quite how to explain it, but somehow the 3 men suddenly were the Lord God, and the Lord God was the 3 men. Abraham couldn't explain how that worked when I asked him about it afterwards, even though he was the one sitting there with them, looking at them and talking to them. But anyway, God, who is somehow also the 3 men, said to Abraham, "I'll come visit you again in 1 year's time. When I do, Sarah, your wife, will be holding her own baby boy in her arms." As I told you, sometimes God is funny. I had heard a promise of a son so many times by now, but never this specific, and I just couldn't believe it. Come on, I was 90 years old. God could have given me a baby the first time we met, when I was already 65, which is still impossible. But God held out another 25 years, and now, me, at my crazy old age, was going to have a baby? Could Abraham and I even do the necessary business to create a child at our age? No, ridiculous, comical, laughable. So I laughed. I laughed and laughed like a crazy woman. Half of it was my disappointment. I was just exhausted at all the empty promises. But half of it really was just finding it funny. God couldn't be more ridiculous if he tried. Well, God might be funny, but he's still God, which means you can't hide anything from him, even inside a tent. Next thing I heard, God was saying to my husband, "Why did your wife laugh at me? Why does your wife think old age is a greater power than God? Is anything too difficult for God? You'll find out soon enough. I'll be back in a year when the 2 of you are parents to a healthy son." I tell you, when I heard that, I panicked. I thought I was in serious trouble. Maybe my laughter would make God change his mind. Now, at last, when the promise was finally being fulfilled, I went and ruined it by laughing at God. I was so horrified that I shouted from inside the tent, "I didn't laugh! I didn't laugh!" And then, for the very first time, God spoke directly to me. Remember, all this time, Abraham was the only one to have direct conversation with God. I only heard about it secondhand or overheard it. But in this very moment, God stopped speaking through Abraham and spoke directly to me, Sarah. And God said, "Oh, yes, you did. You laughed all right." You might expect that was the end of it, that I lost the promise of a child by laughing. But here's the really funny thing. God seemed to think I was funny for laughing at him. God didn't seem angry at all. He seemed to think my response was appropriate. And then God got the last laugh. Sure enough, within a year's time, I was holding my very own baby boy on my lap. God had told us what we should name him, Isaac. Isaac in our language is the word for laughter. That's right. My laughter took flesh and was born and sat on my lap and nursed. As I proudly told anyone who would listen, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears about this will laugh with me too. Who would have thought God would keep his promises after all this time and at my great age? but he did, and I'm holding the proof in my arms. Sometimes God is pretty funny. That was enough for me personally, and I'm glad God looked after me personally. But God also had bigger plans for a lot more people. God kept his promise to me and Abraham, so God could go on keeping his promise to many generations to come. Our son Isaac became the father of his own son named Jacob, and Jacob became the father of 12 sons, and they became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it went on through the generations, more promises, more surprises, until at last, through our sons, God sent his own son. That was his ultimate promise. But that is a story for another day.